Hi guys, and in this lens review we're going to be having a closer look at the Canon 85mm f1.4L IS lens designed for Canon EF mount. And I'm going to start right now. What is up guys, Photo Fever here and welcome back to another lens review. Today we're going to be having a look at a lens I've always wanted to test, the Canon 85mm f1.4L IS lens. Now Canon have actually got three 85mm prime lenses in their EF arsenal. They've got the Canon 85mm f1.8, which as you can see, look down here, I've already made a lens review on that, and they've also got the incredibly expensive but very wide aperture f1.2. So this is a lens that fits almost bang in the middle. So is it worth buying over the other two, or is it worth maybe buying one of the Sigma or Samyang lenses on the market? Let's find out in this lens review. So the first thing I want to talk about guys is the build quality of this lens. Now I have tested a lot of Canon lenses to date, and I must say this is an amazing lens when it comes to build quality. Now this lens is predominantly made out of premium plastic, which makes it a little bit different from some of the Sigma and Tamron lenses on the market, but because of that it is a lot lighter. But apart from that, I must say the overall build quality of this lens and the actual design is really, really good. And you've got all of the features that you expect from a lens of this price point. As you can see here, you've got a manual focus window, as well as a really smooth and quite large focus ring. And you've got two switches on the side here. So you've got your focus switch here, as well as your image stabilization switch. You've also got weather sealing with this lens, which is actually quite unusual for a prime lens. So overall, this lens scored quite high when I actually tested it when it comes to build quality. So I'm going to be giving it the full marks, the 10 out of 10 when it comes to build quality and the design of the lens. So the next thing I want to talk about guys is the all-important image quality. How well does this lens fare up versus its more expensive 85mm f1.2 counterpart? Let's find out by having a look at a few sample images that I've taken at my latest portrait shoot. So here is the first sample image here. Now I shot this on my Canon EOS R5 using the EF to RF adapter. And I must say this lens worked incredibly well with the latest mirrorless cameras that Canon have to offer. I thought the eye tracking of the Canon EOS R5 works incredibly well with this 85mm prime lens. And if we go ahead and zoom in, you can see this lens is incredibly sharp. And it is exactly the same when we go and have a look at the second image here. Zoomed a little bit further in, you can see how sharp the eyes are, even at shallower apertures such as f2. And if we go and have a look at the last image here, you can see that again, even shooting at f2, the shallow depth of field where the curtains are creates this really cool shallow depth of field look. But if we go ahead and then zoom into the eyes, you can see how sharp the eyes truly are. And it's the same for all of the sample images you can see here. All of these were shot at f2 and it is incredibly sharp in the center of the frame. So now let's go ahead and look at sharpness and color of this lens, and let's go ahead and use my latest graph that I've made. So as you can see at f1.4, if we go ahead and zoom into the center, you can see that the center is incredibly sharp. But if we go ahead and zoom over to the corners, you can see there is a slight loss of contrast and sharpness. Now if we go ahead and zoom out, you can see that the colors are fairly well represented, although I would say sometimes some of the reds are sometimes blurred together. So let's go ahead and step down to f2. Now you'll notice this is a lot brighter, and that's just due to the vignetting of this lens at f1.4, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Now if we go ahead and zoom into the center, you can see the sharpness has increased. And then if we go ahead to the corners, the sharpness has definitely improved from f1.4. And then if we go ahead and step to f2.8, you get even better sharpness with a slight reduction in vignetting. And it's pretty much the same all the way up to around f8, where this lens is at its optimum. So let's go have a look at distortion and vignetting. Now this lens performed quite well when it came to distortion. There is only an ever so slight amount of pincushion distortion on this lens, but it's almost not noticeable. But what is noticeable is the vignetting at f1.4. The corners are considerably darker than the center of the frame. Now if we go ahead and simply step down to f2, we can push those vignetting all the way to the corners. And then if we step down to f2.8, that vignetting has completely disappeared. And that vignetting never returns after f2.8, and the distortion in vignetting is completely crystal clear all the way until its minimum aperture of f16. So as you can see, this lens performed really well in my image quality tests. The only downside I found was the vignetting. At f1.4, it did have quite severe vignetting. And because of that, a lot of my portrait and wedding photos that I've taken over the last season here, I've actually shot predominantly at f2 with this lens. And because of that, I can't give it the full 10 out of 10, although I'd love to. I'm only gonna be giving this lens a 9 out of 10, just due to the fairly dark corners that this lens has at f1.4. So now let's talk all about the size and weight of this lens. Now, because this lens is an f1.4 lens, it is quite heavy, but how does it compare to the other wide aperture prime lenses on the market? Let's first have a look at the Canon 85mm f1.8. Now, this is the lightest Canon EF prime lens, coming in at just 425 grams. And if we go and have a look at the f1.2, the behemoth lens, which I've previously reviewed on this channel, you can see this comes in at a whopping 1025 grams. So how does this lens compare, having a smaller aperture than the 1.2, but not as small as the 1.8? Well, this lens comes in at 950 grams, only slightly less than the 1.2. And the reason for that is not because of the aperture, but because this lens has image stabilization. That has increased the weight drastically if it was just a simple f1.4 standard prime lens. But let's have a look at the Sigma and Samyang lenses on the market. Well, because of Sigma create their lenses using very heavy materials such as aluminium and magnesium, that comes in at whopping 1,210 grams. For the same aperture as this lens. And if we go and have a look at the Samyang lens, now they use a lot cheaper materials. That one only comes in at 485 grams. So as you can see, this lens is technically lighter than the Sigma lens, but it is still quite a heavy lens, coming in at almost a kilogram. So because of that, I'm only going to be giving this lens a 6 out of 10 for size and weight. So now let's look at the image stabilization and focus motor of this lens. Now straight away, this has an incredibly fast USM focus motor, making it blindingly quick, and especially coupled with the brand new R5 with the autofocus tracking, this has incredibly good and successful autofocus when you're wanting to use it for eye tracking or any sort of tracking. It is really, really good. Now, what I really like about this lens is the shallow depth of field. Coupled with the focus motor, you can create incredibly unique shots. And I must say, this is an absolute favorite lens when I'm wanting to use it for video. Now, what's special about this lens and really unique is it has image stabilization, as you can see by the stabilization switch on the side. Now, this is pretty much the only prime lens on the market that actually has image stabilization, up to 4 stops of image stabilization built in. And especially coupled with the R5, you can get incredibly smooth shots with this lens, making this lens really good for photography and for video. And because this lens is pretty much the only prime lens on the market that has image stabilization, grant you there are a few outliers, but this is probably the best image stabilized prime lens on the market that I have tested so far. I absolutely loved it. And if you're after using it for B-roll, for video or anything like that, this is definitely worth a spot in your camera bag just for the image stabilization alone. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a whopping 10 out of 10 for the image stabilization and also the blindingly quick and very successful autofocus motor. So last but most importantly is the price. How well is this lens priced versus the other Canon and Samyang and Sigma lenses on the market? Well, coming in on the cheapest on my list is the Canon 85mm f1.8. Now this is a really, really good lens, especially for the price point, but all of the other lenses on the market are going to be a lot more expensive. So that 85mm f1.8 is definitely the budget choice on my list. Next is the Canon 85mm f1.4, coming in at a whopping £1,489, the 4th most expensive on my list. And the last Canon lens is the 85mm f1.2, a whopping 1.2 aperture on this lens. Incredibly unique, but you are paying for that, coming in at £1,999. Now, there are other camera brands such as Sigma and Samyang, so what do they have to offer? Well, Sigma have an 85mm prime lens coming in at £929. Now, the only downside to this lens, it is very, very heavy, as I previously discussed, coming in at almost over 1.2 kilos. And then lastly, you've got the Samyang lens, the 85mm f1.4. Now this is one of Samyang's very first autofocus lenses. So the autofocus isn't as good as the other lenses on the market, but again, you are getting that off a cheap, coming in at just £539, just second cheapest on my list. So overall, this lens is actually quite expensive, although it is very unique because you've got the image stabilization, and it's the only lens on this lens that has that. So because of that, I'm actually going to be giving this lens a 6 out of 10 for price. So what are my final thoughts, and should you buy this lens, and is it worth a spot in your camera bag? Well, to be honest, I thought this lens scored quite highly in my tests. I thought it had great build quality, great image quality, and realistically, the only two downsides was the size and weight. It is quite a heavy lens, but it is also quite expensive as well. But because this lens has image stabilization, it is incredibly unique. And if you are a hybrid shooter, so someone that shoots photography and video, this lens is definitely worth a spot in your camera bag. So let's go and have a look at the final result. Well, coming in at 41 out of 50, this is a highly recommended lens in your camera bag. And especially if you're a hybrid shooter and you need that image stabilization, because this lens is pretty much one of a kind, it is going to be incredibly handy, and this is going to be definitely one of your most used lenses. And I actually love this lens so much, I ended up buying it after my test. I actually traded in the f1.2 just simply because of the slower autofocus of that lens. This lens is, to be honest, pretty much an all-in-one wrapped up lens. You've got the great speed autofocus, but you've also got the great image quality, but then thrown in, you've got that image stabilization. So overall, this is a great 85mm prime lens, and definitely the best Canon 85mm prime lens for the Canon EF mount. Brilliant, and there we go, guys. If you want to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, it really does help my channel grow. And also, guys, if you want to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my latest content. Now, my latest Canon lens review you can find just up here, or if you're more interested in Photoshop tutorials, I also do those as well, you can find my latest playlist just down here. But until next time, guys, keep creating.